I want to welcome all of you to, after a long-awaited return to our Bible studies. We're doing Psalm 23. This will be a 3-session class, and then I have something just as a way of welcoming us back to class. I wanted to just play this for you.
Welcome back, Connor.
Welcome back.
Nothing like a timely song like this.
That's right.
But you know, there's something about that song. It's timeless. So anyway, welcome back, everybody.
Yeah.
It's good to be together in this way. For now we do Zoom, and when we can do live, we will do live again. But for now, this works. So here we are. Welcome, one and all. So like I said, 3-session class. We're going to kind of keep this one pretty simple, but it kind of has been following up our recent theme of selecting beloved passages, maybe some famous parables or teachings that we want to get underneath. Well, this is certainly one of the big ones in the Bible. As I was reading some of my materials, it says, there's very rare instances in the biblical tradition where people will memorize an entire chapter. And this is one of them, because when you memorize Psalm 23, you're memorizing the 23rd chapter of the book of Psalms. But so yeah, you can feel proud of that. It is only 6 verses, so that I guess that's meaningful too. But before I got into some of the, like a little background information or anything like that, I wanted to just kind of put it out there to you. When you think of Psalm 23, what are some of the images? What are some of the words that come to mind? You might want to just share a couple words, but you might have a little story to tell too. But tell me what comes to mind or to your heart when Psalm 23 comes up for you. Go ahead, Carol, and then Margaret. Oh, let's unmute. Yeah, thank you for muting. And everyone, I guess, insofar as you can all mute and then unmute when you're talking.
See, it's been so long, I've forgotten all the rules.
I know.
When I was memorizing the 23rd Psalm, my teacher she really emphasized the valley of the shadow of death, because she said back in biblical times, whenever you had to travel, you had to go through deep canyons. And that's where all the bandits were hiding. And so people always felt that going through that valley was treacherous. So to always think about God is with you through the valley and the valley of the shadow of death, through all the dark spots in your life.
Yeah. So the presence of God through the dark and the dangerous places. Right. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else? Margaret, you had your hand up, and then Patty.
I fear no evil. When I was a child, I was scared of everything. And it didn't dawn on me till I was adult what that really meant.
Yeah. And it's really true, because, there are so many layers, and it's like a lot of poetry. What we're experiencing as we arrive at these beautiful words will certainly inform what we take away. But that description that you said of learning how not to fear, because thou art with me, and that is incredibly comforting. And as a child, we may have different experiences about the world and how scary and big it is. And certainly those don't just disappear as an adult, but we get equipped with how to manage them. And this psalm is one that is such a profound little teacher on how to do just that. Patty? And then
so the word for me is shepherd. And I did a little research on that, and it's interesting to me because in Luke, the shepherds were the first one that God announced Christ's coming to. The shepherds at the time of Christ were seen as sinners, as the least of the least. they were at the bottom of the totem pole. But they hadn't always been that way. In the beginning, shepherds were honored. If you look at back in Genesis and some of the earlier works, but when they went to Egypt, Egypt hated shepherds. They were an agricultural community, and they thought the sheep were going to get their crops. And so over a period of time, the idea of shepherdness was a bad idea. And so the fact that God is a shepherd is really interesting to me in that regard. It's a mixed metaphor. It's one of humility, but it's also, it just speaks to everything that we've looked at in the past. So that's very exciting to me. And the notion that this psalm is placed between Psalm 22 and 24. I'm sure you're going to talk about that, so I'm not going to talk about it.
No, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I think I was going to talk a little bit about particularly Psalm 22, but it is relevant there. And there's a connection oftentimes between the way Psalms aren't necessarily just put there arbitrarily. There's a theme, there's a strand that often courses through them. And Patty does raise a great point there, that when you look at Psalm 22, especially in relation to Jesus sort of very intentionally using words from Psalm 22 on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? Psalm 23 becomes that much more of such a powerful statement, a claiming of the presence of God, of the ability to manage to navigate, to address our fears in the times of trial. It's very powerful. And then Psalm 24 picks up on similar themes too and carries it forward. And I also want to say that the shepherd theme is such an important one that we obviously will be talking about. But historically within Israel, it was a very positive metaphor. You had the Davidic king, the shepherd warrior kings that were sort of the model for the way kings were meant to care for their people. So that was a very positive historical analogy that then did become somewhat degraded over time because of experience, because of just shifting in economy, not only in the places around Israel, but even within Israel, as it became more agricultural. Shepherds and the way they were looked at did shift. So in some ways, within the New Testament, to reclaim that role of shepherd and the prominence of shepherd was a bit of a touchstone, a return to some of those past references, or a reclamation of identity in the face of a changing world, or a world that it was often sort of had antipathy towards shepherds. So very good acknowledgement there. But yeah, the shepherd theme is a very powerful one throughout the tradition. Marilyn, I saw your hand up next, and then Boyce.
Yes. For me, the 23rd Psalm, right from the very beginning when I memorized it, when I wasn't very old, 7, 8 years old maybe, has given me comfort. And I have recited it to myself when I really felt like I needed to be comforted. And I had, like Margaret, I had a lot of fears as a child, lots of nightmares, just really quite scared a lot of the time. And the 23rd Psalm would bring me comfort. And then I had, as an adult, a very dear friend die. And as I was dealing with the grief, I just sort of say the 23rd Psalm to myself over and over again. And it brought me comfort.
Yeah, it is. It's a go-to passage for us in those moments. So the times of danger, like Carol noted, the times of fear and trial, the times where we just feel where we're facing death and grief, those types of things. It reminds us that through all things, the presence of God is real, and we are held by that presence. Thank you. Boyce?
There
you go.
It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about the 23rd Psalm probably in 20, 30, 40 years. And yet it brought back memories when I was younger, because to me, the 23rd Psalm was a description of God's relationship to me. And the shepherd theme, he was a guider, took you in the right direction. He was a protector and a comforter. And somehow, I don't remember memorizing it. I don't remember studying it at all. But somewhere in my life, I read it, or it was read to me, and it seems like I have taken that. I see God as a friend, the best friend in your life, always there. And I think I got that from this psalm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you asked that question, I thought, well, what do I know about this? And yet it seems like I have completely immersed myself in this passage to where that's the way I see God and me, God's relationship to me.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a deep intimacy here that is an expression of connection that rivals any other of the poetic ways that the relationship between God and humanity is expressed. And what's so remarkable is it's in Hebrew, it's only 57 words. In English, it's a little bit like close to twice that. So it's very, very brief. And yet it somehow conveys all that Boyce just said and what everyone's been saying so far. That's why it's kind of, I find it to be a good exercise to ask this question, because you're hearing so many different ways that this psalm has spoken to us. Anyone else? Bob, and then Bonnie.
My sister arranged this reading during my dad's funeral, and I thought it was very appropriate because he flew military airplanes in 3 wars. And I can always remember in high school, I read a book called God is My Co-Pilot. And I often wondered if my father felt that way.
Yeah. This became a prayer of the trenches in World War I, and then certainly was very common to be held in the pockets of soldiers or recited by soldiers, sometimes inscribed on helmets, because just what you said, Bob, it is a way to remember the presence of God, to cling to hope in the times of trial and in the valley of the shadow. So certainly, yeah, that's very, very poignant in the way that our military has sort of held on to this psalm. Bonnie.
It reminds me of the references to the shepherd that are in the New Testament, where it says, my sheep hear my voice and I know them. And then there's the parable of the lost sheep, where even if there's one sheep missing, the shepherd goes and finds that sheep. So it really, I think it just tells me the Lord is my shepherd. You can put your faith and trust in the shepherd because he has your best interest. He is never going to leave you. He's always going to take care of you.
And, and you bring up a good point that I want to state clearly from the beginning. A lot of us, whether you're a farmer or whether you've just talked about, sheep, whether you've had experience with sheep or not, a lot of us receive this message that sheep are stupid. And it's really not true. It's really not true. I will say that they're not the brightest animal, but they are very intelligent. They can pick out the voice of their shepherd. They know. And if you ever go to the Highland Games or something like that, and you watch the sheep herders and their dogs it's pretty amazing what they can do in tandem with one another. But sheep are sort of finicky, maybe stubborn. They do require a certain type of care in order to live their best life. So I just wanted to say that from the beginning. We're not going to go to the place that sheep are stupid, because too easily that becomes a metaphor for the way humanity is often seen. And in God's eyes, that is not the way humanity is seen. Too often, the theology that's presented in our churches presents us as these broken, incapable, creatures that need saving all the time, that need rescuing all the time. And that there's some truth in that, but we have to be careful the degree to which we use those metaphors. Patty.
I just want to piggyback on something Bonnie said, that the phrase, my sheep hear my voice and I know them. The know, that kind of a know is a very intimate know. It's a relational know that God is talking about, that they're talking about in relation to God. It's very intimate, and it's also it's a kind of reciprocal thing. It's that kind of knowing.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting to me. Thank you, Bonnie.
I'll add one thing. When I learned the Psalm, I didn't memorize it in terms of the words, but I was assisted in memorizing it because of a song. And it was sort of like the song that goes, the Lord's my shepherd, I shall not. And that one, it was just these beautiful lyrical, this expression of the Psalm. And I remember as a kid, I so often didn't like the way religious people sang the Psalms. I thought it sounded mostly terrible, most of the way that the cantors and different people, I'm just expressing it through the lens of my childhood memory, but there was something about that one that seemed to work. And I know there's different settings, there's different ways, we've all heard different versions of it too, but that was the way it spoke to me. And it was always sort of a lasting impression because of that, because I just loved the song itself. And so it stayed with us. And I think that's what it does. Whether you actually memorized it or whether you've been aware, kind of like Boyce said about, I haven't even thought about this for so long. For so many of us, where it is written right here. And at the different times in our lives when it needs to, it finds its way in. It finds its way to our awareness because it's telling us some critical things. And that's the brilliance of it. In like I said, 57 Hebrew words, it conveys a theology that many books don't convey. And you all have been speaking to that theology, the theology of the presence of God in the times of fear and evil and death, the reality of the shepherding love of God and the way God leads us to the places of our deepest nourishment, that we would be provided for what we truly need. So many other places that you've mentioned. This psalm kind of captures that an essential theology, which is why it's so beloved, because really it's 6 verses. It's so short, but it's just so beloved, so powerful because it says so much more than the actual words. I go ahead, Patty. You had something else?
I just wanted to make a comment. In my Bible, it says that this is to the leader according to the deer of the dawn, a psalm of David. And they speculate that the deer of the dawn was a song, a tune that this song was sung to.
Yes. Yes. And there's a lot of that. You'll see these notes in there. Sometimes a reference to what seems to be a tune. Sometimes that word Selah is in there after a psalm or in between. And they think that that's some type of a musical cue that maybe tells them when to stop, when to pause, when to start again. There's different ways. Some of this is, we're just not fully aware of how that all comes together, but it does seem that the Psalms were originally presented as songs, as worship music, as something incorporated, because they sort of name in the way songs do for us in modern days, the truths that are most important and life-giving. But you raise another important point that I wanted to get to, and I'll just take the moment now, and that is, who wrote it? Who wrote Psalm 23? Well, I can tell you, if you grew up going to church, most of you probably were told that David wrote not only this psalm, but all the Psalms, all 150. And what you have is, that is most likely not true. there is near unanimous consensus amongst modern scholarship and historical scholarship that it's virtually impossible for David himself to have written all of the Psalms. Some of that is because when you read the Psalms, there's references in there to times in the Babylonian exile, which happened literally hundreds of years after the time of King David. There are also certain Psalms that contain idiom, Hebrew idiom, that was not used until way after David. So what it suggests is when this says a Psalm of David, he may have written some Psalms. He may have written this Psalm, because he was a poetic, musical warrior, shepherd king, so it fits with something of his experience and the way we know him. But nonetheless, to say that it's a Psalm of David may mean that it was published in honor of King David, or from the house of King David, or in the style of King David. There's so many different ways that it could be. And the truth is, we just don't know. That's the wonder of our tradition, is that we were not provided these autographed kind of linear documents a lot of ways. This is poetry. This is the wisdom of generations. And it seems to me that the ancients knew better than to ascribe it to one person, because this is the wisdom of what much more than that. There's something that comes through here that's beyond a single composer. We get into that because that's our modern era. We're into precision, to facts, to understanding, these little minutiae, whereas the ancients seem to have a whole different sense and appreciation of the richness that comes through, and that this was written by a culture. So it may not have happened, it may not reflect a specific instance, but we know, as is so often the case, how true it is, because it reflects the experience of life and the experience of our faith and our relationship with God in so many ways. We're not going to read this one, we're going to recite it together, the first two verses. But before we recite those first two verses and kind of get into them a little bit further than what we have, any other further questions or other comments or thoughts? Yes, Horty.
My dad was a very loving, but a very strict disciplinarian. And I remember the resonance that I experienced when it said in the 23rd Psalm, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." And I really had to wrap my head around that, especially as a teenager, that what is this really about? My dad's disciplinarianism. And I remember standing at the bus stop one morning with a friend, and I was all huffy and grumpy, and I said, "Oh, my dad won't let me go to such and such." And he said, "At least your dad cares where you are." It was so poignant. It was really a life-changing moment for me. Yeah. So that particular phrase of being guided and nurtured and kept in the right way was really powerful for me, especially in my teenage years.
That gave me a chill to hear you say that. Very beautiful recollection. And you're right. I mean, I think most children, and maybe most of us, thrive when we have a clear understanding of boundary. We may not like it. Okay, we kick against it. That's what we do when we grow. But in hindsight, I think we find a deep comfort knowing that those boundaries were set in the interest of love. And the very thing that you said, they reflect the thoughtfulness of one who cares for us. And it's not to say that the rod and the staff represent the permission for corporal punishment for children. Some people go there. We look to oftentimes justify ourselves when we come to some texts. But what it does suggest is that that the rod, the staff, they fend off the enemies, or they help do that. not necessarily all enemies, but there's a protection element, and then there's a boundary element. There's steering, guiding, that sort of thing. That's deeply comforting. So yeah, thank you, Horty.
There's the hook at the end of it that brings you back.
Yeah, exactly. We've all had to been called back. And a lot of times
You are not going there.
Yeah. And a lot of times when even though we might kick against it, we realized, oh my goodness, I'm so thankful that it worked out that way, even though in the moment we might feel quite differently. And all that, what's coming up for all of you right now in your own lives, is summarized somehow in this little miniature theological discourse. So that's why it's wonderful. Anyone else before we recite it together, the first 2 verses anyway? It's not going to take long, but why don't we do it then? Just the first 2. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. Okay, that's all we're going to talk about today. Just those first few lines. And, you know, I recognize that doing Bible study like this, sometimes we're going to get into it a little bit. We're going to kind of get into, like I already talked about how in our modern culture, we like to do the minutia stuff. I like to do that too. I don't pretend that that's the end all be all, and that truly what we've just talked about is where the meaning and the grist and the meat, so to speak, of this lie. But nonetheless, I do find that sometimes getting underneath it and behind it might inform our deeper appreciation. So that's the intention of this. Please don't misunderstand. I'm not about to try to tell you every single thing about each line, but I do have some insights from a variety of books that I read or that I've experienced through my seminary and this, and as do you. So that's what we're doing here today. So why don't we start by getting a little bit behind what we mean when we say, the Lord is my shepherd. What's being said there?
To me, it's submission.
The mission?
Submission.
Oh, submission. Yeah. Okay. Well, and in that sense, then, if the Lord is your shepherd and you're submitting to the Lord as your shepherd, then what it brings up is who is not your shepherd. And that's where, you know, each one of us has to grapple with that. But that's one of the things. To say it is to name the Lord as my shepherd, and then so all those other shepherds are not, i.e. Caesar, i.e. acquisitive nature, anxiety, fear, you know, all these different things. They are not my shepherd. Okay. Anything else? To say the Lord is my shepherd, what else does that convey? Bonnie?
The one who guides me.
Yes. Well, that's sort of claiming that the Lord is the one who is your guide, on whom you are or that you're modeling your life, the one whom you are following. Yes. Carol, anything to add?
Well, I learned it with the emphasis on the word my, because I was taught that it was written by David, and David had spent so much time being a shepherd. Now he recognizes the Lord is his shepherd.
Yes. And that can be very powerful. But I also, one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to maybe pull it out a little bit away from David, because then when we read it this way, we're not just looking over his shoulder and through his lens of his life, which is a very powerful one, which is very meaningful and is rich, but it allows us to claim that my for ourselves. And that is truly where the tradition is asking us to go. That's where later Jesus wants us to go. Jesus wouldn't be so interested in whether or not David understood that the Lord was his shepherd. You know, Jesus would say, well, what say you? So that's where that my, I think, you know, it just opens it up. And so it becomes a more personal statement there. Patty?
Well, when I was a teenager, I raised sheep. And I was the shepherd. I was a crummy shepherd, but one of the things that I learned taking care of sheep is that sheep are not docile. They have their own opinions. And what it was is that for me to know that the sheep were mine or I was theirs, that was a reciprocal relationship. It wasn't a power over relationship at all. And it was difficult. I mean, it took a long time to get any kind of relationship at all. So there was struggle, not just with the sheep, but with me, the shepherd. I mean, it was very interesting experience. And that doesn't leave me as I look at this psalm, that sheep have their own opinions about you as the shepherd. And they struggle with you as you struggle with them.
Yes. And so, you know, it is a relationship. It's not a one-way street. It's not all about the shepherd. The shepherd is certainly crucial. The shepherd is a guide. The shepherd is a leader, but there's a dynamic relationship, as you're saying, between sheep and shepherd. And so the sheep in their own way may well be teachers. And so if we open ourselves to that possibility, it sort of allows us maybe to find something different in this psalm that we hadn't noticed before, because maybe we had seen it through a very specific, you know, lens of shepherd and focusing on shepherd and we being the sheep who are always needy. That may well be true, but there's more truth. There's more truth in that, perhaps. I thought I saw one more hand. Was it Bonnie or was it Boyce? Okay. Still muted, Boyce. He's just being dramatic. He wants us to really appreciate the wisdom that's about to unfold.
Voice press and hold the sound bar. You'll be
Space bar.
Oh,
There you are. This
okay.
better be good, Boyce.
This is a gem.
All right.
To me, that one little statement describes God. And the rest of the psalm is then taking out the details. This is what this means.
Yeah.
And but to me, the relationship, it tells me what God is going to, his relationship, or not his, God's relationship to me.
Yeah.
But my relationship has to have this huge amount of trust, because I'm giving myself totally in God's hands, or the shepherd's hands. And just like the sheep, they have to trust their shepherd to go in the right direction, to be safe, protect, calm, etc., etc. I have to do the same. And anything else that comes into my life, I need not follow it unless God's there. So that to me, when that little statement, it says, God's your shepherd, get in line.
All right, I'll give it to you, Boyce. That was a gem. That was a gem.
Oh, really?
I mean, I really do think that first line does establish what is the crux of the whole thing, and the rest unfolds. We live in a world that will present to us the storms, the tranquility, the sorrow, the joy, all of it. And through it all, there is someone who yet cares for us and seeks our best and seeks to protect us. So that is what's real. And I love what you just pointed out, because we were just talking about the dynamic relationship between shepherd and sheep. Well, sheep, one of the things that is required of sheep is trust. They must trust. Yes, the shepherd must be trustworthy, but sheep must trust. And we live in a day and age right now where we know how hard that is to do. What do you trust today? You know, that's a big question. But a lot of us have seen where the maybe the sources that we used to always trust, whether it's of information, people, corporations, whatever. There's a lot of mistrust today. And so things to put our trust in something is no small matter. Okay, so that's part of the dynamic relationship that's being called out here. I'll take it one step further. So God cares for us like a shepherd. If the Lord is my shepherd. Okay, great. But what does that really look like? How would you describe what God's care as a shepherd really looks like? And don't just dismiss this, because I think it's really what this psalm is about. What does that care look like? What does God do for us in terms of caring like a shepherd? How does that play out? For example, oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
One of the things that that just struck me that I never really thought about before is that the things that God does have my best interest at heart. So being led to lie down in green pastures, rather than stay on a bunch of thorns, beside the quiet waters. I don't know, but somebody said earlier on that the sort of the rest of the psalm kind of fleshes out what the Lord is my shepherd, what kind of shepherd God is going to be.
Yeah.
And anyway.
There's a few places that came to my mind. And again, there's many, but here's one example of what shepherding looks like in terms of within the, partly within the tradition of ancient Israel. In Genesis chapter 31, you have Jacob, who was a shepherd at the time, going to Laban, for whom he worked, and who was the father of Leah and Rachel, both of whom he married. And there's a couple verses in there that have come to be known as the Shepherd's Creed. Okay. And I want to just share these couple lines with you as a reflection point, that this is one of the things that shepherding looks like. What Jacob says is, "These 20 years I spent in your service, your ewes and she-goats never miscarried, nor did I feast on rams from your flock. That which was torn by beasts I never brought to you. I myself made good the loss, whether snatched by day or snatched by night. Heat afflicted me by day and cold by night. Sleep fled from my eyes." That's called the Shepherd's Creed. What does that communicate to you, if anything? What stands out for you there? Margaret?
He's always there. God never fails us.
Well, God is always there, but is the shepherd in that passage, does the shepherd prevent all calamity?
No.
Right. And that's the thing. The wolves are real. The sheep get snatched. They get taken. They get torn. But the shepherd never stops caring, never stops seeking, never stops trying to be the guide, the protector, the comforter, the caregiver. And that's so essential. We talk about this in so many ways, but there's never a promise made in this psalm or anywhere else that to follow the shepherd, to put your trust or your faith in God, will protect you from all vulnerability. We're human.
Your internet is unstable.
Life by its very nature is vulnerable, and we are at risk. But despite that reality, God's presence is real, and the shepherd is there for us, to love us, to hold us, to guide us through all of that. Jane? Yeah.
When you ask this question is, how is he specifically the shepherd in my life? I kind of started jotting down a list because I feel very blessed that he's been very real in my life since a child and as a shepherd. But it's really small things, a lot of the times, just my morning cup of coffee and devotional. Words speak to me, and it's like God just speaking to me in that little passage. It's scripture. It's a conversation when somebody calls and has encouragement. It's a walk, taking a walk and feeling in awe of God's creation and how it just soothes and comforts me.
Yes.
It's clarity when I need to make decisions. It's, it's just all those ways that I truly, truly feel guided, comforted, cared for, when I get frazzled and, the real stuff of life is happening. So
Yeah.
I think God is very present and real. I feel very blessed.
It's such a powerful statement what you're saying, because yes, it is often those simple things. And it comes down to this experience oftentimes for us of even me. God knows and loves and cares for even me. The God that created the stars knows every hair on my head. What a powerful, overwhelming reality. And to experience that, we often find that we come to know that through those kind of experiences that Jane just said. But, I also want to say that is present in the tradition. And one of the other ways that struck me, if you seek to read the Bible, most people do this. They'll start at Genesis and they'll just try to read straight through. And they go, and Genesis is awesome. Exodus is better. Leviticus gets tough. And then by Numbers, you're out. I'm out. It's just lists of people. Forget it. This is terrible. Who wrote this? Okay. People don't make it very far through Numbers. Most of us skip Numbers. Okay. I'm going to say something about Numbers. Numbers is a book that is like a census. It was written after the time in the wilderness, and it was a means of counting how the tribes had changed in their journey from Egypt and to now into the promised land. Okay, it's pretty significant. Now, scholars consider the actual numbers of Numbers to be very unreliable, but here's what's reliable, and here to me is what the powerful takeaway is that the book of Numbers symbolizes that God knows each one of us, and that God seeks to know and account for each one of us and loves us, not in a making a list, checking it twice kind of way, but in a shepherd kind of way, that when we are lost, God seeks us, that when something happens to us, God wants to know our name, and it matters. That is powerful. And I think it speaks to, in that grand way, okay, it's a boring way for a lot of us, but now maybe you'll have a different impression of Numbers, but in that larger way, in the way that book communicates it, I think it's saying much the same thing that Jane just said. I can experience the presence of God because in my life, I can wake up in the morning and feel God in that thin place, whatever that is for us, knowing that we are known and that we are cared for. And I understand that doesn't necessarily feel that way our entire lives. We feel anxious. We feel distant from God. Absolutely. Just like sheep feel distant from their shepherd. But nonetheless, through all those times, this psalm is trying to encourage us to remember that despite our impressions, despite our sense of where God might be, God is never anywhere but here. Patty, and then Bonnie. Unmute.
One of the things I see God is as a mentor, and a mentor by example. His faithfulness to me is the invitation for me to be faithful to God. It's really a powerful statement that I can do it, and that I will not be forsaken. I will never be seen as somebody who can't do it. I may fall down, but I can still do it. And that comes through God's faithfulness to me. And I mean, it's a really interesting experience. It has, when I feel like saying, I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry, this is just not it. That faithfulness says, yes, you can.
Yeah.
And I think that is at the heart of what forgiveness is about. That it's about yeah, you screwed up. You can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the faithfulness.
Amen. Thank you. Bonnie, did you want to add something to that too, or say something else?
Well, this is going to sound silly, but I can't stop thinking about my cousin Harry, who is a sheep rancher up in Wyoming. And he had a huge sheep ranch, miles and miles and miles, square miles. And he had these guys out in the wagons, the sheep herders that worked for him in different locations around the ranch. But and I was up there a couple of times. And I don't know if I would consider him a shepherd. This was his business. This was an investment, but I know it was a heck of a lot of work. I mean, there was lambing season, there was shearing season, there was all these times where he is up in the middle of the night with his sheep because they really required a lot of care. And it made me kind of think of God's really investing a lot of time. I mean, my cousin had X number of sheep. There were a lot of sheep, but there's not as near as many as there are people on the face of the earth. And yet he's really busy caring for all of us. He's really investing a lot. And I just can't stop thinking about him.
Yeah. But it's so important, as we talk about these metaphors, a lot of us in our head, we might be able to affirm some of the things we've been saying, but somewhere inside of us, a lot of us receive the message that if our lives aren't going well, or if we experience trauma or difficulty, or if we fail, that it means God has shunned us, or we have messed up, or we are on the outs with God. And it just couldn't be further from the truth. And so that's why it's so good and helpful, I think, to talk about these metaphors that really so powerfully establish the relationship between God and truly all creatures. But in this case, let's stick with humanity, sheep. That is one of sort of indefatigable love and willingness to continue to go back, to continue to seek, to continue to try to lead. And that in itself, to accept that, leads us potentially to that place that Patty mentioned there, and that truly you did too, Bonnie, of just that leads us to a little bit more grace and forgiveness, so that when we mess up, it's not all on us, but it's about remembering that the shepherd that we follow, that we really reclaim when we say this psalm every time, is the one that's still calling our name, even when we've gotten lost. And that's one I find that in many of our experiences of life and religion, we hear that one and we receive it here, but often our life experiences take a little bit longer to actually fully integrate it. So that's why I think it's important, that this psalm tries to lock in on that. Marilyn, and then Horty. Try the space bar thing.
Hold the space bar down, Marilyn. Hold it down.
Why don't we go to Horty and then we'll come back to you, Marilyn, okay?
I keep being struck by so much of what people are saying, especially in examples of real sheep, of the dynamism. And when there was just the mention of forgiveness, I remember being told once that one of the hardest parts of forgiveness is believing you'll be forgiven. And when we may feel distant from God, when we do feel distant from God, that the dynamism is that the relationship to return is always available, and that there is no question about the forgiveness, allowing us to move back into a full relationship of reciprocity, as we've talked about. But the real dynamism of when we are distant, it's often up to us to accept that we can return that. And it makes me think of the Tool folks that are driving down the street in the truck. And the woman says, you know, when we were younger, we sat really close together. And the driver of the truck, the old man says, well, I haven't moved.
Amen. Thank you, Horty. Marilyn, you want to go for it?
Can I try again?
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know what I did wrong the other time, but at any rate, I have said before, and I think it may be a slight exaggeration, but that I went something like 40 years without attending church. But during that time, I didn't ever become an atheist or even an agnostic. And I began to reach out and get to different kinds of religious traditions like Buddhism and Taoism. And then all of a sudden, I was ready. I had moved here from across the country, and I just was ready. And I started coming to church at our church, and then joined. And if I ever miss, and you notice I'm not there, you know that I didn't miss easily. Something happened that made it really difficult to come. But I think that kind of reaching out, God reaching out for me and me reaching out for God, I've started to meditate, I started to chant, I started doing all kinds of things during that time when I wasn't in a traditional kind of way connected. But I was sure ready when the time was right.
Yeah, and that's this psalm in that way kind of patiently waits for us, reminding us of what is true until we are ready to receive it. And so this psalm in itself is a metaphor that's similar to the life of faith that you have lived, Marilyn. So beautiful. I want to, go ahead, Carol. Yeah.
I just wanted you to expound a little bit more of makes me lie down in green pastures, restores my soul. Is that slow down, wait for me? But I would just like to hear you comment a little more.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we'll get there. We're going to go through I shall not want and then green pastures, and we'll do waters today. We won't do the soul one today. We'll do that next time. But no, thank you. We will get to them. I want to just say one more little thing, because I found this and I just thought it was such another beautiful expression that kind of picks up on what we've been talking about in terms of what shepherd love looks like. How many of you either know or have ever seen in person Michelangelo's Pietà? Okay, the famous sculpture of Mary holding Jesus after he's been crucified. Okay, it's incredibly powerful. But here's something I found on it recently that really kind of shifted something in me, and that is that, you know, in many ways that picture of Mary holding Jesus like that is not reflected in the biblical text. In Luke, she's there, or is it John? Geez, now I forget. It's one of those two, where she's there at the crucifixion, but there's never any indication that what that sculpture pictures actually happened. Okay, she's not really presented that way. And it's one of those situations, it doesn't necessarily have to have happened in order to be true. But here's the reflection that I saw that really shifted in me. What if that is not really, or what if it's not just Mary holding Jesus? What if it's God? That is the feminine picture of the mother creator love for her child, that can't stop the suffering, but will never stop loving through all things. That to me is another powerful picture of the shepherd love, of the love that you're all describing in the way you know and hold this psalm in your heart, in the way that faith has been lived for you, that God isn't there to shield everything and prevent all of it from getting in. No, it's not how life works. But to know that one that holds us, that cries with us, that can give us still a reason to get up today, because there's hope. because we still have a guide. We still can see the power of love, and that love never dies. All of those messages come through. So I invite you to stay open to the ways that different, I don't know if it's art or music or other ways that this theme may come through to you, and hold on to them, write them down, whatever, bring them to the class over the next couple of weeks, see what comes up for you. Let's move on to the next phrase, the simple phrase, I shall not want. What does that mean? When we say I shall not want, what do we mean when we say that? Go ahead, Carol.
It's the old want versus need.
Well, it's an interest, really, the reason it's kind of a question is because that's our English translation, okay? The Hebrew is much clearer, but our understanding of want, a lot of us mistakenly think it means desire, okay? And it's not really. It just means that we won't be lacking for the stuff we need, very much like you were saying, Carol. But we can get a little tripped up in that. It's not a huge thing. I think a lot of us understand, but really to say I shall not want means that I shall not be lacking for the things that are essential. No, that's different. I shall not want, if we think it means I shouldn't desire, that can easily then fall into that trap where we think God's supposed to answer all our questions and solve all our problems. That easily can fall that, well, I shall not want, so I shouldn't be wanting for anything. So that is unfortunately where we go there though, but it's not what it's trying to say. To say I shall not want, in the context of a Hebrew worship poem, is to recall the time when all they did was want. All they did was lack when they were in slavery. Okay. And then through the course of liberation, even in the wilderness, they were provided for. That's what all those stories were. They complained like crazy, but they were provided for. And you go back and you read the stories. They had the food and the water. Yeah, they didn't like it, but they had what they needed. And there's even that little anecdote about that even their clothes didn't wear out, that kind of thing. It's just this way of suggesting that what we shall not want means it's a time, or it's an expression of gratitude that we really have what we need in this life. We're given what we need to thrive, to live by the shepherd. Boys?
My version says, rather than I shall not want, it says, I don't need a thing.
Yeah.
It's really plain.
Yeah, but it's trying to be clearer. And now that sounds like Eugene Peterson, the message.
Yeah.
And that's what he did as a poet. He wanted to get behind some of the more arcane, a little bit of the King James, even some of the more modern vernacular that comes through in the NRSV and the NIV. He takes that poetic, and it sounds more like colloquial, but it really gets to the heart in a lot of ways. And that's why I love the message, because he is a poet writing poetry. So yes, I think that conveys a very similar feel. Patty?
One of the things that is a concern for me in this phrase is that I can see where I shall not want, but I think about the women, especially in Afghanistan. I think about the poor in our country. And I think how easy it is for me to think that way, but maybe it isn't so easy for them to think that way.
Yeah.
And I know that this is about coming through trial, that we shall not want when we're in trial. So that's really about, for me, the wanting of the soul, because Christ himself died on the cross, but he didn't want. I mean, he trusted God beyond that. It's just really hard to deal with, because we have a short life, and going through those kinds of trials, I mean, it's hard to say how to trust when that's going on, and to stay faithful.
Yeah.
And so it's easier when you're a comfortable white middle class person, but it may be really hard if you're in a country which is war torn, or in a country which is bigoted as ours is, and we have our lower class, our class of sheep.
Yeah.
which
No,
is
I
really
think it's
all of us.
important to call to mind that we must be careful about being naive about what this may mean and to sort of limit it to our experience. But certainly, I think what it's trying to say is that when we approach life or let life come to us without a spirit of anxiety or fear, when we have that trust, it frees us from so much navel gazing and internal sort of turmoil, and still frees us to be agents of love in a world, to then be there for one another in ways that still can be compassionate, can be life-giving, even despite the fact that we are dying or being hurt inside. So there's something there too, that if we really approach this from that perspective, if the Lord is my shepherd, then I have a different kind of freedom to live and to be a source of water and life for others, instead of always being so inwardly focused on my needs, my troubles, my sorrows, that sort of thing. So that, but it doesn't take away the grief and the strife and the challenges that are so present for so many that we may not face, but still it liberates us to be able to see and to respond. And that's the calling.
I think of,
oh, you have
when I-
follow-up. Yeah,
I
and I
just,
saw
when
Kathleen.
I think of that, Dan, I think about Christ's ideas of us being in God and God being in us. And it makes me think that we're in some ways called to be shepherd apprentices, that those of us who are fortunate are there to also be God's agents, to remind those who are not fortunate that we are there for them. Being the body of Christ, we are there for them. That's how we are Christ. And that's how we have God in us to be there for others.
Yes. This does not name the end of our relationship, but it develops over time. And as we understand what it means to be in that relationship of trust, then we do move and we grow. And I do think we move into an apprenticeship of shepherding others. It's sort of like that line, I think it's at the end of Matthew, but where he says, "You are no longer servants, but I consider you friends now, because you have seen, you have lived this, and now go be that source of life for and with others." There's something there for that. That's so crucial to this message. It's not just about receiving it and resting on those laurels and being in your own still waters and green pastures just for your sake all the time. Kathleen, I saw your hand up.
Well, I was just going to concur with what Patty said, that about the Afghani women and children. And I'm thinking even of the young boys who are being raised in that culture, who will be formatively changed because of this. And it's heartbreaking. And then I compare it to the fall of Saigon in 1975. And I just want to tell all of you, our church, I think Jane was a member then, but our church in 1981 sponsored a refugee family, a boat family that came, and they lived with Perry and me for a while. And then we have kept up with them all these 40 years this month. And last weekend we went to the wedding of their daughter that was born here. In fact, Jane, you were at the shower when Lam Tui was born. And the gratefulness that they have for our church is just so strong, that we reached out to them. And so this is the last few days, especially since we were just there at this wedding, that it just, we can do things. We can be God's apprentices. And I'm so thankful that our church took that step 40 years ago, and this family is eternally grateful to each one of you. So it's, but this psalm is very comforting, but emotional also.
Yeah. But I think it stirs us to that this psalm comforts us, not so that we may sit still, but so that we may love, that we may live in ways that kind of continue to grow that, to be that. And so that's where it leads us. And that's really that's the arc of faith. Faith is never about just arriving at a place. No, it's a constant journey. It's a constant movement, a constant growth. And it's the way, it's not the spot or the destination. A lot of us act like that's what it's about, but no, it's about the way. And being on the way means acting in ways that see and make a difference.
Maybe
And
we'll be called upon to do that again.
we may well be.
But I also know that we need to be open to walk through that door.
Yes, that's right. And that's part of what this is trying to teach us, to not get so wrapped up in ourselves, but to constantly practice that spirit of walking openly and with trust. And as we've said, that's not easy to do. And so what happens when we experience the lack of trust in certain areas of our lives, it starts to close us off. And so, as you say, we must, if we are going to continue to be the church, if we're going to be shepherds with and for one another, or even good sheep, we must remain open. Did I see another hand? All right, well, why don't we go to the part about the green pastures? What does that connote? This idea of laying down, he makes me to lie down in green pastures. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. What does that mean? Birdie.
Sheep lying in green pastures are in the midst of plenty. There's an abundance that God has provided there.
Yep. It's plenty, it's nurturing. Generally, a green pasture is somewhere that affords lots of good visibility, which sheep need in order to feel safe, so that they can enjoy the food. They're not just nervously eating the whole time, but so they can see around. It's this experience of lushness, something so nurturing, so supportive about it. What else? Makes me to lie down in green pastures. What does that maybe refer to, if you can think of anything from the history of Israel? Because this is what's being played on. There's so many levels. There's the sheep shepherd level, there's the me level, and then there's a historical level. There's lots of levels, but there's a historical connection here to the time when they were, say, not able to lie down in green pastures. It's a time that refers, many rabbis have pointed this out, that is almost like a direct way of saying, never forget the times when we were not able to stop working, to lie down in the lush places because we were working in the deserts, in the harsh places, that we didn't have this. And so now this has been provided to us. Let us remain grateful for the fact that it's here. Even in those times when we're not necessarily lying there, we can remember that they're still there, those pastures. Okay, so there's that historical connection to ancient Israel in the time of the Egypt enslavement. Okay, and then in the time of wandering as well through the desert. Anything else that you can kind of come up with that has to do with what is it about laying down in green pastures? Yes, Patty.
Well, I just wanted to continue what you were just talking about, because there's this whole idea of the land of milk and honey, which the people were promised. But I think at the time of Jesus, there wasn't a lot of milk and honey around, and there weren't a lot of green pastures. And certainly with the destruction of the temple, that was another place in the desert where people went. And so in perspective, there's times when we can be nearer to green pastures and times when we're not. People in Afghanistan are not near the green pastures, or they can't see them. This is really an invitation to remember that they're there. We just have to keep trust and find them again. And that we may find them not in literal green pastures, but in the trust of God. And I think that's really hard. I think that's a hard one. I think it's really hard when we're distracted by extraordinary pain. That probably I can't even imagine what it's like over there.
No.
I can't imagine it. I can imagine it, but I can't imagine it really.
No.
Nor what it's like to be oppressed as a person of color. So that kind of trust is extraordinary.
Yeah. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter who survived the Holocaust, wrote several books, but one of them was called The Sunflower. And as I recall in some of the introductory notes, he talks about there were times that the only thing that got him through was memory, and that the Jewish people might be of all the cultures in the world, the ones who rely on and who have this beloved relationship with memory, because it calls to mind that presence in the midst of all the hell when it happens. And so memory is so key, and it doesn't take it away, but it gives you the hope to go through what it is and to keep going. You know, and that's really, this psalm is about keep going, even though you are going through this, thou art with me. And that is just one of those places that sometimes all we have is memory. We may not feel the presence. We may not be able to see even the potential for green pastures. Okay. It's kind of like now with the fires and everything. We look out and we just see, are we ever going to get rain again? You know, we wonder these things. Is it ever going to be different than this? Is it only going to keep getting worse? Are we going to die in, 10 years shorter than we might have because we're all breathing this foul air all the time? I'm just naming some of these concerns because in our own realities, we're faced with different things. And yes, we cannot understand what is happening in these areas of just critical, cataclysmic events like in Afghanistan. But the question is still begged. When life hits the fan and we feel a sense of hopelessness, disorientation, and loss, this psalm calls us back to, at the very least, memory, which can hold us and give us the chance to take that next step. Because if we don't take that next step, then we cannot be agents. We can't be on the way. You know, we get lost. We start to fall into that hole. And again, it's not a hole that God's creating for us. It's what others have said. It's we sort of set ourselves apart. We start to do this. We start to fall inward exclusively. And that's where it gets hard, dangerous even. Jane?
You know, the verse, be still and know that I'm God, came to me just now, in that it isn't always literal green pastures. It isn't always the comfort of your cozy couch or whatever is your little sanctuary in the world. And, you know, how do we all turn back repeatedly to that space of be still and know that I am God, and find that green pastures just within us as we experience God in our life? And then when I hearing you talk about Afghanistan and all these tragedies, and we've had our own tragedies locally with wildfires, and maybe experiencing God will be us just sending bottled water and somebody drinking real fresh water when they're in the midst of nothing. And that moment, just for that 1 minute, they'll experience God through something we have done. So I like that our focus has kind of helped us to think of less about our own selves and our own self-focus, and, you know, what can we be doing? What can we be doing to bring some sense of love and hope to other people?
Yes. Yes. Calling us to that outward reflection, that outward place, to not get lost within ourselves. And don't misunderstand, it doesn't mean we don't attend to our grief and our struggle and our pain. That's very important. But just not to get stuck there, not to end up getting lost in that place exclusively. Jane?
And what has been shared is it's very easy for me personally, in my abundance of, you know, goodness, let's face it, I have everything. And even in my fear and anxiety over all these things that have been happening around us, I can come back to that, be still and know that I am God. I have a lot to bolster me and my faith and my emotional health. But these people that don't, I mean, these people that literally don't have any of that, how can we be reaching out? And I just think, man, I need to be less self-focused and just get out there somehow.
All right. This is a clarion call I'm hearing right now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's continue. Oh, Boyce, yeah, go ahead. Boyce, I saw your hand.
Well, that passage, as we've been talking, it reminds me of something that I used to have on my office wall, that life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. And so to me, that passage says, there's going to be negative things that happen to you, and you can respond in a way that's going to be calming for you. Green pastures reminds me of this very serene, calming place. And that if you believe in God and say, God is my shepherd, and put your trust into God, that even though I'm going through this horrible time outside me, things are happening to me, I can still be calm within and trust that the outcome will be good, even though I may die. And so it's a real, I agree with all of you, what's happening in Afghanistan and how in the world can those people be calm? But to me, that passage is saying, we have it within ourselves to maintain and still have a serene calmness through God, our shepherd.
And it can be a hard-earned calmness. You think about people like MLK, that classic story of him wanting to stop because it was just killing him. And he was sick of the death threats, or not sick of them, but just, it was exhausting. He was just constantly stressed and anxious, not sleeping, all of it. And he's just basically, in the similar way that Jesus did, asked the cup to be taken. And then through that hard-earned expression, then came to the place of finding that calm, that resolve within, that allowed him to keep going, despite the fact that, yes, it did end up taking his life. But then again, it didn't take his life. He gave it. And that's the difference. That's the difference. If we go through life in fear and anxiety all the time, then our life and our freedom and all those things, our opportunity to love, will be taken from us. But the perspective of this psalm is that we are able, with God, to live lives where we get to make that choice to freely give of ourselves and make a difference, to be the sheep and the shepherds, with one another in the world. That to me is what we're talking about. That's the difference. And that's what Jesus did. That's what he embodied. No one took his life. He gave it.
Well, and theoretically, he lived on, just like we live on.
Well, we all, in one way or another, we do. Yeah. And when we seek to live outside of ourselves and make a difference in our world, we live on in bigger and bigger ways, bigger and bigger ripples.
Yeah.
Still waters. Why are still waters important? And what do they refer to? So he leads me to green pastures. That's sort of idyllic, almost, ideal place for sheep to graze. And continue the metaphor, again, not just for sheep, but why are still waters important?
You can drink from them.
That's a good point. Philip Keller, in his book from 25 years ago. It's got some nice insights. It's called A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. It's got some limitations too, because I don't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions, but he's got some good insights in terms of, understanding some of these shepherd and sheep metaphors. And one of them that he keyed in on was this whole still water thing, and that sheep will only drink from still waters. Okay, if it's moving water, according to what he said in his experience, they will die of thirst before they drink from moving water. And I'm not sure, he described it as because they're just so naturally suspicious and cautious. And if they can't see, that's just too vulnerable for them to do that. They have to be able to really see and feel that sense of safety. So still water is the one way. Now, he also says that sheep, if left to their own devices, will go drink from like a cesspool. Okay, because that's still water too. Okay, but they will make themselves sick. So there's that sense of still waters. They need to be guided to that still water, okay, by a shepherd. But they require still water in order to really find their refreshment. And actually, that's one thing I want to say too. The word in Hebrew for still water is actually two words, is me menuhot, which means waters of rest and relaxation. Now that just sounds so nice. Waters of rest and relaxation. That's what still waters literally means. Tell me what else that you can make in terms of, maybe it has to do with sheep and shepherds, but maybe it's bigger than that. Why are still waters important in terms of, some of the ways water is presented in the Bible, in stories you're aware of? Why are still waters? What does that communicate?
Still waters runs deep.
Still waters run deep. You can see deep into still water when it's moving, and that might be part of the sheep's understand, or that why they don't drink from running water. You can't see into it. You don't know what might be lurking under the surface, but with still water, you can see it. Did I see another hand? Yeah, Bonnie.
Well, I was just thinking of when Jesus calmed the sea, and he said, "Fear not." And this is kind of the same thing that you're saying. Still, when there's still waters, there's no fear, as opposed to turbulent or stormy waters.
Yeah, think back to the story of creation in Genesis. The waters were turbulent, and it was formless and void and everything. And it's just this mysterious, what lives in that water? Leviathan and all these unknown monsters and things. And there's chaos in the waters, the churning of the waters. But when Jesus, enters the storm and says, "Be still," there is some measure of, means of calming those unknown, scary places. Okay, that's just a general way. Water is often presented as that land of unknown, a wilderness place, a place that's scary, because we don't operate very well in water as human beings. We can't see into it so well, similar to sheep. Okay, so the stilling of waters communicates this willingness on the part of the shepherd to lead us to places where it isn't always going to be so turbulent and scary. Okay, that there is someone who's looking out for us, who knows we are naturally afraid, perhaps, and then is looking out for our best interest. Okay, not going to get rid of all the turbulent water, but will help us find our way to that water, which is still. Okay, which will nourish us. It's a powerful comment. It connects to a lot of the richness of the tradition in terms of what water represents. The Noah's Ark story, another powerful expression of water and its cleansing, but that was just so dramatic. But yeah, that wasn't still water at all. Okay, when the waters receded and there was stillness there, then that's when life could reemerge, that sort of thing. But so there's a lot of this connection to sort of when we see still waters, you can gain a lot by thinking of, well, what is not still waters? What is the opposite of still waters? These green pastures, what would the opposite of that be? And how might that connect to the self-understanding of the ancient Israelites? And oftentimes you find yourself coming back to the stories of creation and the Exodus, these foundational stories, oftentimes the exile in Babylon or Assyria. So you find these being touched on and they end up being just deep tap roots into not only the psyche, the identity of a people, but the hope of a people as well. And they lead us to that place of hope. Remember the God that leads us to those places of lushness and where the water is refreshing and restful, that sort of thing. Any other comments on this? Yeah, boys?
Well, still waters also represents there's no storm.
Right. That's right. Yeah, it's a time of calm. It's that life is unpredictable and that storms will arise, but the shepherd is one who cares for us, who looks out for us and seeks to guide us to the places where the storms are not. And that's life-giving. That's comforting. Again, life is going to present plenty of storms, but this one who is our advocate, who is our shepherd, is seeking to lead us, even to cajole us if necessary, but to guide us one way or another to those places where we might find life. Green pastures, still waters. Kathleen?
And lack of undercurrents that are going to tow you under.
Sure. Yeah, because again, you can see into it. It gives you that fuller sense of peace and tranquility. And I think we know, maybe it's when you're on vacation, or maybe it's after you've been so thirsty, maybe you worked outside and you come in. There's something so satisfying when you just get that water and you just feel a sense of calm around you. It just feels so refreshing, so good. There's something being conveyed about that deep sense of tranquility. Wow, that's a beautiful image. It's a powerful image. That covers the immersion into those two verses for today. Next time, we're going to cover verses 3 and 4. I do have notes for this. We're going to publish them on the church website, just like we always do. I will compile this recording here, and you'll be able to watch this again if you'd like. But before we sign off, I just want to make sure there's no other closing comments from today's study. Marilyn, and then Bob.
It's so good to be back.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah. It's good to see you in whatever ways we get to see each other, be it Sunday morning at worship or here in this place. It just feels good. Feels good to be back again. Bob, did you have something you want to say too?
I was just reminded of when you were talking about in turbulent times turning inward and losing the guidance that the Lord has blessed us with. When you talk about still waters, I think of turbulent waters, you can drown.
Yeah. And when you watch the movie The River Runner, which is coming out on Netflix on August 25th, you will understand in its own profound and somewhat obvious way, the way turbulent water can roll us and pull us under and sometimes never let us back up. But yeah, the still waters is a metaphor for those places where the water is just life-giving, where it doesn't threaten us, it doesn't take from us, that we can just receive the rest, the relaxation, the nourishment that it is. That is wonderful. And each one of us, in a world that so often creates turmoil and anxiety, that sense of deep calm, even if just for a moment, even if it just lasts for a sip, might be enough of a reminder to get us to the next sip, the next time, through whatever today may bring. So that's the promise, that presence with the one who seeks to guide us to those places. It doesn't promise that we'll get there today, but that we will get there, okay? It's been a lot of fun to be back together. As always, I'm so thankful for your willingness to come and to share your experiences, your wisdom, and your hearts. And so I look forward to seeing you again next time.
Thank you.